motivated in that level of fear are not calling it. How do you get people to,
right,
in a significant way, change that tide of those 10 calls that they probably received yesterday and no one?
We've done this before. Calling senators is hugely important. They're going to have the chance to vote tomorrow. They may not vote tomorrow. The House vote today was overwhelming. It looks like the Senate may not vote tomorrow, but they may. It's hard to know. The bottom line is you have to be just as outraged at the racism of these attacks as the racists are who are using the fear-mongering to get people to call and say, build a wall and keep out anybody that doesn't look like me and my white neighbors. You have to build the outrage. That means you have to be shocked. You should be appalled at what your governor has done in your name. And then you go out and say to your neighbors, and you say to your schoolmates that you see tomorrow, and you say to the people you work with, and the people in your mosque, and the people in your church, and the people in your synagogue, and the people in your union, and the people in your bowling league, we have to do something about this. This is not okay. He's speaking in our name. It's in the front pages of the New York Times that we are the state with the mayor who's winning the race to the bottom. That's not okay. I don't want that in my name. I don't want that with my tax dollars. That's what you say. That's what you say. And then you hand somebody your cell phone and say, here's the number, call him. I just called him, you call him now, it's your turn. You started by one-on-one. How many of you are going to write a letter to the editor tonight? Really? Come on, folks. I flew here. You can write a letter. And let me just tell you something about the letter. One of them will be printed. Most of them won't. Get used to it. But make sure in every letter you mention the governor's name, and perhaps the congressman's name, and perhaps the senator's name, because that guarantees that they will see it. Because the first thing every political staffer does every morning is do a Google search for her boss's name or his boss's name and find everything that mentions them. If his name is in it, he'll hear about it. If not, he may not. So call your senator, write the letter to the editor. If you get enough of them, write a letter in the next day. You know, in fact, everybody on this side of the room, write your letters tonight. This side, write your letters tomorrow night so that you're pacing them out so they start to publish these letters every day. This is really important stuff. It feels kind of silly, but it's really important. Radio talk shows are big out here, right? Right-wing radio talk shows? Call one of them. Call one of them. When you get to the person who's screening the calls, and they say, what do you want to talk about? I want to talk about refugees, and sound really angry. And they'll assume, yes, I would not, I've been a journalist for too long to say I wouldn't propose that you lie to them, but if you say a certain thing like a catchword like refugees and you sound really angry, they're going to make certain assumptions. That's not your fault. And then you get on the air and you have an audience, right? We need to do all this. That's the answer. They are mobilizing. We're not. That's not okay. You need to be outraged about this. This is happening in your name. I mean, frankly, right now, if I were from Indiana, I'd be a little hesitant to go to some places in this country because people are going to be really, really pissed off at you. And until you say, I didn't vote for him. There was an old bumper sticker that people used to have about Nixon that some of you will remember. It said, don't blame me, I voted for somebody else. It was the McGovern campaign, right. Don't blame me, I voted for McGovern. Maybe you need to do that. Get bumper stickers made. Don't blame me, I voted for whoever it was who ran against Pence. You know, all of this, this is serious. They are fomenting a level of racism that is going to haunt our children's future. We have got to stop this.
Senator Coates also came out really strong.
Target them all.
Yes, sir. Well, Phyllis, we've been through this before here in the State of Confusion. Last year, or recently, there was this piece of legislation in the State General Assembly called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, blatantly discriminatory against LGBTQ, you know, other kinds of, virtually everybody, yeah. So, but thank you for whipping us up into a frenzy.
That's my job. So how many of you are going to write letters tonight? Okay. Now you can have cake.
Tim.
So I'm extremely worried that we're going to forget about the refugees while we're arguing about who can come to the United States. I am extremely disturbed about the perspective. You know, there's over 4 million. We're talking about 10,000. They're facing winter. I hate to see these people freeze and starve in the snow while we're fighting with Bennis.
Very important question about what happens to the refugees there that are facing winter coming on and have nothing. And while we're worried about the 10,000 that maybe will come here, although right now it's not looking anywhere close to 10,000 is going to come anytime soon, I think the two are very important, both of them. Both issues are hugely important. The refugees overwhelmingly do not want to go to Europe or the United States. They want to stay near their homes. They want to go back when the war is over, when the repression is over, when the fighting is over, when the bombing is over. So they want to stay closer. The ones who are fleeing are more desperate than that and feel that they can't survive. Challenges because of their children or whatever it is that they have to flee and look for permanent resettlement somewhere else. It's a tiny percentage, as the European leader said. It's a tiny percentage of the refugees that are trying to get to Europe or the United States. And the United States has no intention of taking more than this shred. I mean, the fact that this one family was in a refugee camp for 3 years before it could get approval to come here tells you the problem of this outrageous kind of vetting that treats every Syrian as if they are assumed to be a terrorist until they can prove otherwise, and that takes 2 or 3 years. That's an outrage. That's an outrage. But what I said earlier when I went through kind of what the US policy should be, one big chunk of it is a vast escalation in our support for refugee humanitarian assistance. That means money to the UNHCR. The United Nations 3 months ago announced it was having to cut all food aid to all Syrian refugees in Turkey that were not living in the registered camps. Only about 1/3 of the refugees were in the camps. The others were trying to get a job somewhere, even though they weren't legally allowed to. They were living with relatives. They were living rough in the streets. They were suddenly being cut off from the one kind of aid they had, which was food aid from the United Nations, because the UN had no money in their budget. And that's the responsibility of the United States. We have in our country 28% of the wealth of the world. We should be paying first, starting right now, 28% of what the UN needs for this next period, which is about $5 billion. Right now, it's about $1.5 billion that we should just write a check. Period, full stop. Then we should talk about how much more we should provide, because we claim to be a nation of laws and concern for refugees. But right now, we should pay our share, which is 28%, and there should be enough of this bragging that we pay more than anybody else. We are richer than anybody else, and we better pay it.
We're going to come back to a couple of questions for Phyllis before we close. But Sam, this might be a good point. Do you want to say a word about what Indiana Center is collecting and the work that you're doing and Amar for Help Syrian Refugees? And I also know that we have from the group, the working group, we have you here tonight, and Amar Masri, and Jane Caldwell, and Dr. Ghanem from that working group. And so maybe say a quick word about that, if you wouldn't mind. Come on up and use the mic, Sam.
Yes, Sam.
And then we'll come back to questions for Phyllis in just a minute.
I guess I'll wear both hats and talk about both groups. We have a group of us that went to Europe in September, and we started a group called Help Syrian Refugees. We were channeling money to groups that are helping Syrian refugees that are leaving the camps in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon that Phyllis was talking about. We continue to channel money to them. And I think Caleb's here. He snuck in. Caleb, do you want to talk about what we're doing for resettle Syrian refugees in Fort Wayne, or would you like me to? Okay, so we also started a working group in Fort Wayne to resettle refugees here. Next, we had a modest goal of resettling 20 families in 2016. We are in the process of commissioning a plan to do that. We were about halfway towards raising the $8,000 that it's going to take. I think the paper misquoted me, but if you're interested in donating, see Caleb after the meeting. And we're going to press on with that. I've been talking with local attorneys about the lawsuit for injunctive relief against Mr. Governor Pence.
The honorable. Yeah. The honorable.
Dishonorable.
And that's the kind of thing we need to do. You know, I reached out to the two agencies that were the targets of those letters from the FSSA, and I just think, you know, we all can do something like Phyllis said, divvy the room up, do what you can. But these are important issues, and I personally don't like to. When I go to other cities, when I was in DC recently, when the LGBT issue came up, I was apologizing for being from Indiana, and I'm tired of that. I think other voices need to be heard.
I'll come to you in just a second. If you want to make any donations for humanitarian aid for help Syrian refugees, you can make your check out to Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, and then just put Syrian refugees in the bottom, or put your cash in an envelope and put Syrian refugees, and it all goes to Sam and Caleb and Amar and the rest of the folks who are doing that work. So Sam and Caleb and Amar, thank you very much. Ahmed?
I just wanted to add to that we need to realize that one big thing that's happening in Fort Wayne is that our city, the Allen County Department of Health Commissioner, Doug McMahon, has been in these conversations for at least a year, asking about learning from our resettling of the Burmese refugees here, how can we avoid the mistakes that we've had? She commissioned a group, started off with a couple of people growing into the resettling of the refugees. Our mayor has always been welcoming of refugees of different people, and something that Dr. Bennis said yesterday in the reception that I think should be taken to heart is that we should have a cities campaign. Now, I've been told before that politics starts at home. So Pence in his office can do whatever he wants, but we can get our city where the dynamics are, that we're a welcoming community. We can get our mayor, who's been re-elected based on a lot of good things that he's doing, and one of them is his welcoming of the refugees, to make a statement about that, to challenge the legality of Pence's claims or refusal of accepting refugees. So I think we have a lot of great momentum in our city, and it needs to go beyond just the humanitarian aid. We've collected, I think, over $100,000 through SAMS, at least in the past 2 or 3 years, that went to the refugees, that helped medical relief. We need a statement from Fort Wayne, the second largest city in Indiana, to go to Governor Pence. I just wanted to add
that. Dr. Caldwell.
Dr. Bennis, how are we going to get $4.5 billion for aid to the UN when we have to give that to Israel for the next 10 years? I thought that would be part 2 of your lecture tonight.
Well, we didn't have enough time for that, but it's a huge problem. We're a rich country. Israel's a rich country. Israel, depending on whether you believe the CIA or the IMF, is either the 23rd or the 26th wealthiest country in the world. I'm not sure why we're giving them aid at all, let alone military aid that's being used for illegal purposes. So yeah, a campaign to redirect the aid to Israel, which is now being renegotiated. You all know, I think there's a $30 billion agreement, a 10-year agreement. It comes out to about $3.1 billion a year. That's about to expire in 2017, and the negotiations are underway. And we thought that they were going to ask for a really outrageous increase to go up to $47 billion instead of 30. But it turns out that's not true. When Netanyahu came, he asked for $50 billion, and it looks like that is what it's going to go through. $5 billion a year of our tax money going straight to the Israeli military to continue carrying out illegal actions and war crimes. Now, I would say that that's something you might want to write about in your letters, although sometimes it's better to only have one issue in each letter, because otherwise you get people a little confused. But for us, in terms of understanding, that is one of the big questions. When we're looking at what makes us safer, is it jobs and healthcare and education at home and real foreign aid abroad to poor countries that need it, or is it supporting militarists around the world? A reasonable question.
Well put.
You brought up terrorism a few times in your talk. My question is, what is terrorism, and what happens when we interrogate the application of the term to certain conflicts and only certain actors in those conflicts?
Very important question about the definition of terrorism and why is it that it's only applied to some and not others. In my book, which I'm sorry we didn't manage to get the books here, but you can order it online, Understanding ISIS and the New Global War on Terror, it's done as frequently asked questions. And one of them is, what is terrorism? And then another is, what's the consequences of there being so many different definitions? There's something like 150 separate definitions of terrorism in legal, not the political definitions, but the legal definitions in various legal systems in the US and globally. The State Department definition, which is a pretty good one as these things go, and could be the one that the US could rely on, has several characteristics to it, but they have amended it in recent years. So the main thing is it's aimed at civilians, and its goal is not the murder of that person or those people so much as frightening somebody else. That there's a political motivation. And that it's carried out, this is where the State Department one comes in, by what they call non-state actors. And that the victims are non-combatants. So that's like this, so that sounds kind of okay. It's non-state actors killing or attack or causing harm or whatever to non-combatants for political purposes. The problem with that is, well, the problems with that are, number one, a non-combatant includes soldiers. So what they should have said is civilians. Civilians. Killing soldiers can be terrible, but it's not terrorism. Yet routinely we hear, for example, the attack on the USS Cole, a warship armed to the teeth with sailors on it. We hear that called terrorism. We hear the attack on the Marine Corps barracks in Saudi Arabia called terrorism. It was a Marine Corps barracks. What made it terrorism? Filled with Marines. It wasn't filled with non-combatants. They weren't combatants at that moment, was the point. So that's one. Then carried out by non-state actors. Well, what about state terrorism? Our own and other countries. Israel, Saudi Arabia, other countries have done it, Iran. What about terrorism that's against civilians for political purposes, but carried out by a government? Why aren't we talking about that as terrorism? So it's a huge problem. I think there's the old definition of pornography in the Supreme Court. I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. That sometimes works for terrorism. The Paris attacks were clearly terrorists. There was nobody there was being targeted. There wasn't a person there that was the target that someone else, they were trying to murder somebody and somebody else got caught up on, in the way of the bullet or something. This was deliberately choosing people who had no connection to anything in order to frighten everybody. But it is a big problem that terrorism doesn't have a uniformly held definition. It's particularly problematic when you have things like what I mentioned earlier about the US Supreme Court decisions that identify what you can and can't say, can and can't teach. An organization that happens to be on the anti-terrorism list of the United States. If you had contact with, for example, somebody in the PKK, the Turkish Kurdish organization, that has a violent past and has had an armed struggle perspective, but also has a lot of political organizing and whatever, and you tried to teach those people, that group, her, him, one person, whatever, how to access the UN's human rights system, you would be liable for 20 years in a federal prison. That's just nuts. That's just nuts. So the whole question of how we define it plays a huge role in what we do and don't do to combat it. And it makes everything very hard. I want to just say one thing before we go on to our next and probably last question or two. And that is that I forgot to bring a notebook, but I wanted to get a sign-up sheet for those of you who would like to get my occasional, like every month or so, when I'm not on the road, newsletter by email. So there's a sign-up sheet over there. If you just sign your name and email, but print, please, so I can read it, because I always get them and I can't read a bunch. So write very carefully so I can read it. Just name and email is all I need. Thank you.
Yeah, we do have time for one more question, and Fred, maybe you could jump on in.
And I'm going to piss some of you off. But I worked with refugees for nearly 40 years, on 29 different countries.
whole issue of terrorism and legal definitions for that permeated the career all those years, beginning with the boat people from Vietnam. I have seen some terrorists that have come from our refugee groups, 3 at least, 2 from Somalia, and a recent one. So it does happen. The other problem that I have, and I'm going to hopefully do this in a Journal Gazette article, is that when you have an avalanche of refugees like the Middle East is experiencing, when you have a